And next we have Patty. She's a registered dietitian here with us at the University of Colorado. I just wanted to take 2 minutes just to talk briefly about resistant starch. So Dr. Lynch mentioned it briefly, Dr. Patel mentioned it briefly, but along with the big study that looked at aspirin, they also looked at resistant starch. And so we saw in the aspirin group this potential risk reduction in colon cancer. But in the resistant starch group, though we didn't see that same reduction in colon cancer risk, we saw a reduction in risk for upper GI cancers. So reduced risk for pancreatic cancer, biliary tract cancers, the duodenum, and the stomach as well. So that was really why we invited Patty to share her expertise about how do we get resistant starch into our diet? What could that look like? And, these are cancers that can be harder to screen for. So a 50% reduction, we think is really exciting potential new things to offer in the setting of risk reduction.
Hi, thank you everybody for having me. I'm Patty. I am a clinical dietitian at the Cancer Center, and I am available to see patients. Anybody who is a patient of UC Health at the Cancer Center is eligible to see a dietitian, in case none of you knew that. Okay, so diet and lifestyle measures to reduce cancer risk. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about resistant starch, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention other diet and lifestyle measures you could take for cancer prevention. The American Institute for Cancer Research has done a lot of good research around these topics. These are their top 10 takeaways in terms of things you can control to help reduce your cancer risk. And this is just overall general cancer risk. And so consumption of red and processed meats, being a healthy weight, physically active, limiting alcohol consumption, all of the things you would expect. None of that is a surprise, I would imagine. The limit consumption of sugar sweetened beverage recommendation, I will say that's more in regard to the fact that the sugar is just empty calories and that it adds to a weight gain issue rather than a direct link between sugar and cancer. I always like to clarify that point. And so what we're going to focus on from here on out for the rest of my talk is the one on the end: eat a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and beans. That recommendation is up there for 2 reasons. The first is that plant foods have phytonutrients. Phytonutrients are these wonderful little things that we're not 100% sure how they're doing what they're doing, but they are helping to boost our immune systems. And so each plant has its own phytonutrient. And therefore, the more variety of plants in your diet, the more phytonutrients you get. And that's a good thing because the phytonutrients really like to work as a team. They really like to team up. And so the bigger variety of phytonutrients you get, the better job they do at boosting your immune system. And so that's one of the reasons that recommendation is up there. The second is because those foods are fiber containing. Whole grains, veggies, fruits, beans, legumes, lentils. That's where we get the fiber in our diet. I tell everybody fiber is like exercise. The benefits are endless. You can get, many, many different benefits from exercising. Fiber offers a lot of benefits for our health as well. To just go through a couple quickly, it would lower the risk of colon cancer, cardiometabolic diseases, type 2 diabetes, normalizing bowel movements, maintaining bowel health, lowering cholesterol, helping it achieve a healthy weight. So there's a lot of good reasons why I'm often telling people to get more fiber in their diets. So what is fiber? Fiber is a part of the plant that your body can't digest or absorb. The 2 main types are soluble versus insoluble. Although most of those foods listed up there contain some of both. It's hard to find a food that's just soluble or insoluble fiber. Most foods have a combination of the 2. But the reason fiber is good for us is because your body can't digest it or absorb it. So resistant starch is a type of dietary fiber. To put it very plainly, very simply, that's what resistant starch is. It's a kind of fiber. Resistant starch digestion, this slide is to just show very simply, obviously, why it's helpful, or why we think specifically for this study it's helpful. So the resistant starch in your food passes through your small intestine intact. And that's notable because the small intestine is where the bulk of your digestion and absorption takes place. That's where most of your food is being broken down. The resistant starch is just bypassing that and making its way into your large intestine. In your large intestine, the starch undergoes bacterial fermentation, which is good for its prebiotic effect and because it produces short-chain fatty acids. Very specifically, one of the short-chain fatty acids, butyrate, is specifically of note in terms of its benefits for cancer prevention. So this is a very quick, basic, here's why this is good. And then here's the study that you've all heard about already, where they did a 10-year follow-up. It was a randomized double-blind study. The participants in the study were given 30 grams of resistant starch a day versus a placebo group who didn't get any. They took the starch for a long time, up to 4 years in some cases. And the assignment to the starch group was independent of their assignment to whether or not they were getting the aspirin. And so the wording on that graphic is small, but if you can see the 10-year follow-up boxes, you can see what Lisa had mentioned, that there was a really significant reduction in the Lynch syndrome associated upper GI cancers, not colorectal. There was no significant difference for colorectal cancer. However, gastric, small bowel, biliary, pancreatic, all had significant reductions in the group that was taking the resistant starch. Okay, so how do I get more resistant starch in my diet? This is not an easy thing to do. Not going to sugarcoat it. 30 grams a day of resistant starch is a lot of fiber. You have to think about the fact that resistant starch is a type of fiber. So most people, the average person, isn't even getting 30 grams of fiber total in their diet. Now, not only do you need more than 30 grams total, you need 30 grams of a very specific kind of fiber. So your total fiber intake is going to be well over that 30 grams to get you the 30 grams of resistant starch. So to be perfectly honest with you, this takes some work. This is not something that you can just, oh, I'll make my way through the day and I'll figure it out and I'll eat some fiber here and some fiber there. This is something that takes planning and coordination. And of course, my first thought when they asked me to present on, tell these people what they can do to get this starch in their diet, I was like, well, what did the people in the study do? Because they did this for years. And the answer is they took a supplement. They had it easy. The supplement that they took is not available to us here in this country. So it is unfortunately not an option for you in this room. And so I tried to find the easy way out for you guys and it wasn't there. So now you are stuck doing a lot of planning with your diets if this is something you want to choose to pursue. So, and before I go any farther, I will say if you haven't visited the research booth out there, they have a fantastic handout they've put together that contains all of the information I'm about to show you, which foods, how to do it, how many grams. It's a super helpful handout. So if this is something you're interested in, don't panic and try to write down everything on these slides. Just go get that handout. Okay, so the foods that are rich in resistant starch: legumes, peas, whole grains, wheat, barley, oats, plantains, and green bananas, specifically green bananas, rice and potatoes are all really good sources of resistant starch in our diet. But resistant starch is tricky. The amount of resistant starch in a food can change based on cooking, preparation, and storage methods. So this is why I say don't panic and try to write all this down, because here is some things that change the resistant starch content of these foods. In some foods, heating and cooking them reduces the amount of resistant starch, so you don't want to cook or heat them up. Other foods, the process of cooking and cooling increases the amount of resistant starch. So that would be the russet potatoes, legumes, peas, and pasta. Rice, and specifically red and yellow potatoes, are best to consume after you've cooked them, cooled them, and then reheated them. Chilling cooked pasta for 3 to 5 days further increases the resistant starch in it. And specifically keeping corn tortillas at room temperature for 3 to 5 days increases the resistant starch. So you remember how I said I looked for the easy way out for you? I'm sorry. This takes planning. This is, like I said, this is not something you can just cruise your way through the day and get your 30 grams of resistant starch. This is something where you have to be preparing and planning and thinking about this. So we've got some tips for you that take these into account very specifically. So if you'll notice, canned beans are not something you need to heat and store and cook and cool and reheat. So they can be a nice go-to in terms of adding canned beans to basically whatever you could add canned beans to. So salad, soup, chili, salsa, substituting beans for ground meats in some of your foods. You're going to get a lot of resistant starch with beans. And again, they have less planning than some of these other foods. If you want to make a pasta or potato salad, specifically with russet potatoes, that works with these recommendations because you've cooked and cooled the pasta and potatoes. And so that will maximize the resistant starch. Snacking on roasted lima beans, roasted garbanzo beans, snacking on hummus, making overnight oats, because again, cooking oats reduces the amount of resistant starch. And if you're not familiar with overnight oats, you don't actually cook them. You prepare them the night before, put the oats in a container with milk of whatever kind, if you don't want dairy milk. And then you throw in other good things to make it tasty, fruits, cinnamon, vanilla flavorings, whatever you like. There's 1 million recipes online to help you plan your overnight oats. And so that's a way to get your oats in without cooking them, again, to maximize the starch. You could also include raw oats in energy balls or smoothies, adding green bananas to a yogurt or a smoothie, substituting rye bread in your sandwiches, because when you look at the different types of bread, rye is higher on the list of resistant starch content. Using long grain white rice, again, specifically that type is high in resistant starch. And trying plantains. Most plantains are cooked, which I recognize I said reduces the amount of resistant starch, but having plantains that aren't cooked is not necessarily for everybody. Cook and cool your yellow potatoes and then reheat them to make your mashed potatoes. Again, takes planning, but you've really maximized the resistant starch by cooking them, cooling them, and reheating them before you make your meal. A couple of things I found to help you guys supplement your resistant starch intake, because again, this is to get 30 grams through diet alone is not easy. Banana flour is very high in resistant starch. And so if you are able to kind of use this as a supplement to some foods in your diet, you're going to be able to get a few grams every time you can put a spoonful of this into something. So the somethings I thought of were putting it into yogurt, oatmeal, smoothies, using it as a thickener. You can stir it into stews or sauces, and you can, again, use it in protein balls. I took the liberty of finding a recipe for you. That website is in the corner, a website called From the Larder, and specifically green banana flour in these protein balls. So these are going to be a nice snack for you that's got a good amount of resistant starch in them. So if you start Googling, what can I do with green banana flour, you will find some ways to use it. And then, of course, like I said, you could be stirring it into yogurts, oatmeals, applesauce, whatever you don't mind stirring flour into. Obviously, moist foods will work best. The other little, I guess you would call it cheat I found is potato starch is also very high in resistant starch. The trick here is you can't cook it because then you'll break down the resistant starch. So that does limit how often you could use it. But if you use it as a thickener for custards, pudding, adding it against smoothies, applesauce, it works like the green banana flour does, and will just boost the resistant starch content throughout the day. And I, again, found another little recipe for you on a website called Meal Garden. There is a wild rice pudding recipe, and it uses long grain. You can substitute the long grain white rice and the potato starch, and then you've got a lovely rice pudding dessert that's going to be nice and high in resistant starch for you. So this is doable. I don't mean to make this sound like this isn't something that's achievable for you. That's something you shouldn't bother with because it's never going to happen. But like I said, it will take planning. It will take effort. You really do have to do meal planning, meal prep, and be mindful and pay attention. But certainly you can get the resistant starch into your diet if that is something you've put your mind to. I will finish up with a word of caution. I was worried I would take too long, and so I moved very quickly, but I will finish up with a word of caution. Increasing your fiber can often come with some bloating, some discomfort. And so I would like to just warn you, if you are going to work on doing this, you want to increase your intake slowly. You want to just do a couple more grams every day, every few days. You don't want to just suddenly go from where you are now to 30 grams of resistant starch in one day. You're not going to be happy with me if you do that. And also, I do recognize that the bloating and the discomfort and probably feelings of fullness are exactly what Dr. Aldrich told you were signs for ovarian cancer. So just keep in mind that if you're in the process of increasing your fiber intake, that may be the reason for these issues you're having. Hydration, also really key when you're increasing your fiber intake. You really don't want to increase your fiber and not increase your fluid, because that's going to constipate you. And again, you're not going to be happy with me for telling you to do this. So make sure when you're doing this that you are also increasing your fluid intakes. Okay, and that's it. That's the end of my presentation. And again, the handout that they've put together is really excellent. It lists the different levels of resistant starch in different foods, which is not something I put on a slide because it would have just been a tiny little chart for you that you would have not even been able to read. So they've done a great job with the handout. So please go grab it.